Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to go back to my bare bones editor and create an empty SQL file for the purposes of this tutorial. And it's often helpful just to have an SQL file lying around that you can work with and work off of, especially if you're dealing with the command line, because the command line doesn't tend to remember things very well. So in the kphp SQL folder that I've created on my desktop, I'm just going to create a SQL file called joins.sql. And we're going to do an introduction to joins. So before we go, too far along, I'm going to have to create some tables, obviously. The first table that I want to make is going to be a table for categories. So we're going to look at how we would want to structure a blog. Let's say we have a blog, and in the blog we have postings, like a particular piece of content, and then we have categories. So I want to be able to have categories for my various posts. Now this is called a one-to-many. There is one category and many posts, or many to one. You have many posts that are associated or related to one category. Now the advantage of using a join is that if you decide you want to change that category name, you don't need to go along and start updating all sorts of records for all the posts that have already been categorized. Let me try and illustrate this. So I'm going to start off by saying create table category. We need to start with something, right? So I'm going to create a table called category. And actually, let me just bump up my font size here so that it's nice and clear. And that's a little better. Okay. So here I'm going to say create table category, and it's going to have an ID, which is going to be an integer, and a primary key, and it will also auto increment. And what that means is that every time I do an insert statement, it's going to add a new record to my category table. And also I'm going to have a name. And the name will be a varchar. In other words, it's a field of variable length of 300. And the engine is InnoDB. And I'm going to explain that in just a minute. So let's just go through this together. So this is SQL, similar to what Steph was doing in that other video, except now we're actually describing how we want this table to look. And here we've got an ID, which is going to be our primary key. And just like in PHP, you can have strings, you can have objects, you can have integers, you can have arrays. Well, in this case, this ID is of type integer. And it's a primary key. And what that means is that MySQL is going to pay special attention to this key or this column in this database table, and we'll index it. And this will facilitate in searching and speed things up, and will also make sure that there's only one of every one of those rows, and each row can be accessed from its primary key. The auto increment is a handy little feature where when I do an insert, it automatically adds 1 to the existing ID. So the first thing I put in there is going to have an ID of 1. The second thing I put in there is going to have an ID of 2, and so on and so forth. The varchar is, again, it's a type, much like the integer, except it's for strings, short strings. And the maximum length of my strings, in this case, is going to be 300. The last little bit at the end is important for relational databases. So here what we're talking about is the engine, the actual structure of our table and how that's going to be stored and accessed within MySQL. Think of it as the difference, if you remember back in the day when there was FAT32 and NTFS, there was different file systems, and you had different ways of storing data on those file systems. This is a similar kind of structure where you can have multiple engines, and MySQL is driving those different engines. The InnoDB engine is the most current and the one that's suggested, at least at this stage in the game, and it's great for doing exactly what we want to do today, which is relationships between tables. So I'm just going to select these two lines and hit copy, and I'm going to paste them in here. and I shouldn't get any errors, which I don't, which is good. And if I say show tables again, I should see that we've got a categories table. And if I say describe category, I should see that I've got my ID, and I've got my name, and I've got a primary key with auto increment. And if I do an insert into category, name, values, politics, and then I do another one, let's say international, and then I do a select star from category, then I'm going to have an ID of 1 and an ID of 2, and politics and international. So far so good. So now that we've done this much, we're going to make another table, and this table is going to be for postings. And I'm also going to set up some dummy data here. So we have the category for politics, and we also want a category for international. Let's say we want one for technology, and another one for entertainment, and another one for sports. This is a very generic blog. We're doing anything and everything. And lastly, we're going to have an other category. Now, I'm also going to create a new table, and this table is going to be called post. And it's also going to have an ID. And instead of there being a name with a varchar of 300 characters, there's going to be a title of varchar 300. But there's also going to be a content column, which will be of type text, which means that it can be any length. If you're coming from an Oracle world, this is the equivalent of a CLOB, a large character blob, basically a place where you can put as much content as you want, as much text content as you want. And then I'm going to have a category ID also of type int, and we'll talk about that in just a second, because that's how we're going to build our relationships. So in order for this to be nice and easy to work with, I'm going to create some drop statements. And a drop statement basically deletes or gets rid of a table. So I'm going to say drop table post category and drop table post. So if I take my drop table category and paste it in, it will, if I go show tables, I won't see anything anymore. Now I'm going to take all of this, all these SQL statements, and I'm just going to paste them in one by one. And if I say show tables, I should have category and post. And if I do a select star from category, I'm going to have my 6 categories, and everything looks pretty peachy. And if I describe my post, it looks also pretty good. So there we have it.